Hello, Embers. Welcome back to Ember Exchange. I'm Dylan.
And I'm Jill.
And this is a part one episode again, so it's just Dylan and Jill. Today we're tackling a question that actually the topic was picked by Nick and Heidi this time around. So we're excited to have the second part of this conversation with them. But we're going to start off by defining some things and framing up the conversation of what it's going to look like. And that topic actually is, where does everything come from? Which is a really broad sounding topic. I promise we're going to make it more specific than that. But we're discussing origins of things, and in this case, particularly the earth and people. And so hopefully you're along for the ride, and we'll see why that's important. So let's stoke some conversation. So, creationism is what we could have called this episode. We intentionally decided not to call it that because that if somebody sees that, they are either going to click on it because they care about it a lot, or they're not going to click on it because they don't care about it at all. And I think that's generally the case when you start talking about creationism, or age of the earth, or the origin of stuff, is that most people have in their heads an idea, and I would say maybe specifically Christians. Most Christians either have a very strong opinion about this, or they have an intentionally very weak opinion on it, because they don't want to offend anybody. And I was in that latter camp, not even that long ago. I would say a couple of years ago. I intentionally decided I didn't care about the age of the earth, or whether it's 6 literal days or not, because I was tired of arguing about it. I didn't think it was something that was worth discussing, because I didn't think it was a salvific issue. So if you wanted to believe one way or the other, that's fine. You do you. Not something I'm that interested. And I would actually say for myself, I don't think that that's an appropriate stance to take, and we can get into the reasons why. We'll probably get into some of those later. But I think oftentimes that's what you're going to encounter, is people either care a lot, or they intentionally don't care for the sake of being nice and making friends.
I think the very, very first category you mentioned, though, is like, I don't really know what that is, and it maybe doesn't matter a whole lot, is like the camp that I would have landed in, though.
Okay. Not something that you'd ever researched extensively.
No, and
it just wasn't that important to you.
yeah, it wasn't terribly important to me. Generally speaking, I was like, okay, the earth, sure, cool. How does that, affect my life or my theology?
Right.
Probably not a lot. So, and you said not a salvific issue, so move on.
Mm-hmm.
Let everyone who wants to be loud about it and argue about it, and I don't need to be a part of it.
Right. And like I said, we can get into maybe why we think it's important to have an opinion.
Yeah.
I think I would like to briefly say before we dive in what this episode or couple of episodes is not going to be.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of probably podcasts out there, and certainly books and series of books that have been written on creation versus evolution. And I'm really not interested in having that argument. We're not going to give you the 5 ways to crush the evolutionists, or here's 3 things that young earth creationists get wrong. Because I think it really comes down to where you start a lot of times, right? So a Christian is going to start from the position that God exists and that he created things.
Mm-hmm.
And an evolutionist, secular evolutionist, is going to come from the position oftentimes that there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, if you look at the history of evolution, it's kind of this invented to have an excuse for why we don't need God. And there are exceptions to this, of course. You hear the story about the evolutionist who set out to disprove God and then became a Christian along the way. There are those stories, but the vast majority of people that you encounter that are going to have want to have these conversations, you're not going to change your mind. They're not going to change their mind.
Yep.
And so giving you 5 ways to crush the evolutionist doesn't do anything but make you feel good about yourself in that situation. It's not worth arguing. So that's not what we're going to do. There'll probably be some points that we bring up.
Yep.
What I do want this conversation to be is a look at, I'll call it a third way. And third wayism is something I believe you can look. I think Tim Keller is somebody who often gets lumped into this idea of third wayism. I think we talked about it previously as the nuance bros. well, I don't believe that, but I
Yeah.
don't believe that. I believe something that's very specific and nuanced
Yes.
in between those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone likes me as a result. And actually, nobody likes you because you won't take a solid position.
Yeah.
Anyway, that tells you maybe how I feel about it. But this third way is this idea of the old earth creationist. So somebody who wants to try to meld the ideas, the scientific
Yes.
ideas of evolution in with scripture and the Bible.
Correct.
And so we want to kind of look at that, contrast that with what I would have just called creationism or young earth creationism.
Yep.
How are they different? And why does it matter to you or
Right.
anybody why you should think about these things? So
Yeah. And
that's what we're
as
trying to do.
we dug into those, or as we studied this topic for this episode or this set of episodes, I think there were kind of three categories that I ran into. So what you mentioned earlier, 5 ways to take it to your evolutionist.
Own the
Yeah.
libs, to own the atheists. Yeah.
Yeah. The the let the Christian viewpoint on that was referred to, from what I could find, was actually theistic evolution. So they would still say there's a God involved. Obviously, an atheist would not do that, but it is basically just full blown evolution, or like macro evolution. Like, God used evolution to create the world, but it was just like a tool. So God was like, here's one thing, like one cell,
Sure.
and now let's wait billions of years and it will evolve into what we know the earth to be.
I'd like to put an asterisk on something that we're going to come back to.
Yeah.
You said the term macroevolution.
Uh-huh.
And that is contrasted with microevolution.
Yes.
We should come back to that. But
Okay.
continue with your 3 points. I just wanted to make that note.
Well, I guess microevolution was going to kind of land into my old earth creationism, which, like you said, is kind of the compromise and the nuance between, okay, God did create life over a long period of time, and in some variation, it did potentially evolve, like microevolution. So a lot of the large organisms, I guess is what I'm going to refer to them as, that we see today, did evolve potentially in some format, but it wasn't like from one cell all the way to what we see today, or monkeys to humans. But there's some scientific natural selection evolution involved in there.
And we'll put quotes around scientific
Sure.
because one of the things about
Right.
science is that it has to be observable and repeatable.
Yes.
And
Creation is not repeatable.
Right. We weren't there. And so the only information we have is what was left to us in God's inspired word.
Yep.
We can observe and repeat microevolution. You think about breeding dogs, that's what that is.
Yeah.
But never once in history have we ever observed
A
a
cat.
fish turn into a bird.
Right. Or a cat going from cat even to lion. Like,
Yeah, even within
within a
we'd consider
species.
felines,
Yeah,
right?
or felines.
Now, that's not to say that in the span of human lifetime and modern scientific study that we haven't, but it didn't. So, right,
Sure.
this would be the argument for how did Noah fit all the animals on the ark? Well,
Right.
he really probably only needed 2 dogs or 2 wolves, right? And all of the Chihuahuas and the Great Danes came from 2 wolves
Sure.
over the course of a few thousand years.
Right.
That is microevolution
Right.
and makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And so then to finish off the third point, though, to go back, it would be young earth creationism, or for them, it's just the literal creation account.
Right. So when that second one, what did you describe that second one is called?
Old earth creationism?
Old Earth creationism.
Mm-hmm. Or OEC.
Or
Is what
OEC.
I saw it as. And YEC being young earth. Old earth also always referring to, obviously, saying the age of the earth. So when they're saying old and young, they're referring to how old they believe the earth to be, and old earth being approximately 4.5 billion years old.
Yes.
4.5 billion to 6 billion is the range there. But young earth being somewhere between 6 to 10,000
Right.
years.
So in my looking,
Mm-hmm.
there were a couple of theories that I think in my mind are falling under the old earth creationist perspective.
Okay.
And you separated them out, but I almost feel like theistic evolution kind of is tangentially related to these as well. The idea
Kind of.
being that God was involved, but evolution as a process is what governed the creation,
Correct.
the means,
Old
perhaps.
Earth is much more, I guess, affirming that the Bible and like scientific discovery can be complementary.
Got it. As opposed to theistic evolution, which is what?
It's still going to be sorry, and they would still say that we can discover more, like we're finding God's truths through science, when theistic evolution is just, again, very, very God hands off.
So almost like a deistic
Yeah.
evolution, where
So
God
again,
is
like
the
he was
watchmaker
like,
who set things into motion and then
correct.
stepped back and he just let
And
natural
that's it.
process it. Okay.
And then
But both
everything occurred after
acknowledge that
that.
there is a God, A,
Yes.
and both of them are trying to allow for the earth to be old.
Yes.
Okay. And that's why I would put them under old earth
Sure.
creation, because
Right.
God is still involved.
Right.
Anyway, that's a bit of a digression, because what I wanted to bring up is there were two kind of categories or the named theories which dive into some of maybe the more details on this. How did
Okay.
it happen?
Yep.
The day age theory and the gap theory are a couple of ways that these old earth creationists try to explain what was going on.
Okay. I think I've heard of the gap theory, but I don't know about day age.
Okay. The gap theory was actually the weirder one to me.
Okay.
That one maintains that the days as described in Genesis were
Yes.
actual literal 24-hour periods.
24-hour days. Yep.
But there's this gap. If you
Yep.
read Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, between the verses, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then the second verse, which is now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Between there is billions of years.
Yes. Yes.
And
That there's reference of days, and days were what we would assume were days, but it does not mean that they had to be consecutive.
didn't have to be consecutive, or they were consecutive, but there's this giant chunk of time between God creating the heavens and the earth. Stuff happened, and then
Right.
he said, "Let there be light." That one was weird to me, because that sounds like they're just trying to check all the boxes and make everyone happy. Whereas the day age theory to me sounds more like the theistic evolution, or at least adjacent to it,
Okay.
where a day actually means like an age or a longer period of time,
Right.
and day is figurative. And they would point to things like, oh, to God, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like
Right.
a day. So that doesn't actually mean actually 24 hours. And so God used long periods of time over which he used evolution as his means by which he created.
Right. And sometimes the argument comes up with that is because the Hebrew word used in Genesis, I think, I don't know if I'm going to be pronouncing this right, but it was yom or yom,
Yeah.
Y-O-M. And so that actually, yes, it can technically mean era or period in other places in the Bible.
And even in Genesis, actually,
Correct.
in the day that God created the heavens and the earth, I think that's
Yes.
chapter 2,
And
perhaps.
so,
It doesn't mean
right.
a 24-hour period.
Right.
Even
God
immediately
God
nearby.
is the creator just over the long span of time in that situation.
Right. So those are some of the things that people will point to if they're an
Correct.
old earth creationist and say, well, this is how we take a modern, quote unquote, scientific understanding
Yep.
of evolution and fit it into what the Bible has to say.
Correct.
Look, can't we all just be friends?
Yeah, the point kind of being, again, we mentioned it, or Dylan mentioned it at the start there, but nuancing it a little bit, compromising to
Yes.
science or scientific study, but young earth being quite opposite of that, saying that the 6 days in Genesis are in fact literal 6-day 24-hour periods as you and I know them to be today.
Mm-hmm.
The young earth creationist is going to reject evolution and state that all life was created in their present form during the creation account.
Right. Meaning macroevolution is not, because we've said, right, you can breed
Yes.
dogs and affect microevolution very quickly in your backyard.
Right, right. And I guess in the macroevolution side of things, or things like, yeah, natural selection as they progress and you have that, then the young earth creationist is also going to reject most scientific theory and advocate for the direction of creation of life by God.
Right. Now, maybe we'll get into this with Nick and Heidi a little bit more, because spoiler alert, for their honeymoon, they went to the Creation Museum.
Yeah.
So this is like really fresh for them. And I think that's why they picked this topic. The use of the word theory here is arguably very incorrect, because in
Right.
science, you start with a hypothesis, which is like an idea, like a question. Like, is this potentially true? I think it is. That's my hypothesis. And you don't get to be a theory until you've got a lot of supporting evidence. And
Right.
frankly, evolution has just as much unsupporting evidence as it does supporting. So I don't think it deserves to be elevated to status of theory. But that's also a digression.
Sure. Yeah.
So can we talk about, for the young earth creationists, some of the main scriptural arguments?
Yeah.
Because for them, it's more than just this is what happened. You will often find people who are diehard young earth creationists use it and say that it is foundational to
Yep.
an understanding of the rest of Scripture, even beyond just the notion of, oh, well, we have to take the Bible literally. So, what did you find on that?
I think that one, I'm actually going to go back to old earth. It's a contradiction for the old earth that then supports the young earth creationism idea.
Okay.
And that's just generically in Genesis. The old earth creationist is still going to lean into the fact that there is order in creation. They would agree that our God is a God of order, which we would also say, but not timing, which seems odd because, as you described, the gap theory and what was the other one? Day age theory obviously doesn't allow for timing to be of order. You're like, oh yeah, days, and then there's like this huge gap that happens, right? But when we speak, I don't talk to you or anyone for that matter and say, my work week, and you assume that I was talking about Monday and Tuesday of January, and then Wednesday and Thursday of March, and then Thursday and Friday of 5 years from now. That's not orderly. And so it's interesting that an old earth creationist would say, yeah, there is order. God is a God of order, and there is order in creation. We can see it all over the place. Otherwise, our earth would be tilted and half the people would be scorched, or, you can see it all over. But the timing is not orderly.
Right. Yeah. So appeal to God's nature is one of the ones that a young earth creationist would lean on. I'm going to work backwards, leaving the most important for last.
Sounds good.
One of the ones that gets used is in Exodus 20,
Yep.
when God
The Sabbath commandment.
when God is defining, it's the fourth commandment, that you shall, just as God worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh, so too you shall have a Sabbath where you work 6 days, you shall do your labor, and on the seventh you'll rest, just like God did. And in that understanding, they would say, well, it doesn't make sense for God to have a commandment about the literal days of the week, saying God did this for 6 days and then rested on the seventh, so you should do the same thing.
Yep.
If those days weren't the same. I don't know that that's a watertight argument necessarily, but that's one of the main ones that gets made.
Sure. I don't know how high on importance you would have landed with this one, but just biblical genealogies in general, like Adam and Noah, etc., if you count the years and generations there, you kind of land right in that 6 to 10,000 year mark, which just logically then makes sense.
Correct. Now, the gap theory folks would say, oh, no, that's fine, because mankind has only lived on Earth for 6 to 10,000 years, but the Earth itself is way older, and there was this whole billions of years of era before Adam was created.
Okay.
So that's them trying to get around that. Again, that feels like they're creating something very strange for no reason.
Sure.
But, right, we're just defining. We're not
Yep.
making judgment right now. I think actually the most important argument, or the way that they argue that this is foundational, is to make the note that death is actually one of the consequences for sin. And so if we look at the tree, the command about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God tells them, don't eat of the tree or you will surely die. And of course they do die spiritually. They're separated from God. But we also see that physical death is associated with that. First in the killing of the animal to give them clothing, as well as then in the death of people that follow after that. And so to say, well, anytime you want to make room for evolution, right, you have to allow for death. Like,
right.
that's just definitely, like, a fossil record is the record of death. Right. That's just how it works. And so anytime you want to say, even the gap theory folks, they say that that's what accounts for the fossil record. Well, that means that there has to be death, right?
Right. And that's where the old earth creationist does, again, kind of nuance it and say, oh, well, Adam and Eve, there could have been death prior to Adam and Eve in this gap period or this time. There was physical death, and that's okay. There was not spiritual death yet. And when we speak of the fall specifically,
We're speaking of spiritual
we're
death.
just referring to spiritual death.
I assume we're going to get into this a lot more with Nick and Heidi, so we'll leave that there. There's a lot more arguments to be made. But that one is specifically if you encounter a young earth creationist who wants to make the argument that it's foundational to salvation.
Yes.
That is the reason they would say that there's no atonement for sin, and the sacrifice of Jesus in his physical death is meaningless if death is not a punishment associated with sin. So it couldn't have existed before the fall.
Right. And I think that a big one for old earth creationists is going to be the use of Genesis 1 being viewed kind of as stylized literature, or the fact that Genesis 1, even versus Genesis 2, has kind of a poetic lean, or it's a little bit poetic in nature, and so we don't really know what the genre is, and no one can really define that, and so therefore understanding the 6 days a little bit more metaphorically or symbolically is acceptable, and works fine with gap or with day age, because, well, we don't really know.
Right. And from what I found, because I've heard that argument as well, it turns out that it's actually missing a lot of the key pieces associated with ancient Israelite, ancient Jewish poetry or song form. And if you look at ancient Israelite understanding, they pretty much all interpreted it as literal. And it's only when you get into more modern Jewish thinkers that you start seeing these sort of mystical, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yes.
Mystical interpretations. Whereas, in the time of Moses and perhaps even all the way up through the time of Jesus, that wasn't the case. They were thinking of this literally.
Right, for sure.
So.
Yeah. And then as we get probably more into it in the second portion of this, not only is the question of death and suffering going to kind of come into question, but some questions about the inerrancy of the Bible can be arguments for and against certain theories here, in addition to literally relying and using the title creator to describe God. It obviously comes into question when you are questioning creation. More so in the theistic evolution, all the way over to that side of the argument, but somewhat in the old earth creationism idea too, of, are we questioning God as a creator? Because it's described that way. He is described that way, but to be a creator, you probably had to have created something.
Yes.
To gain that title.
Yep. Okay. Well, I don't know. That feels semi-well-defined to me.
Yeah.
I think we're going to get into a lot of the heat of things. For example, tune in next time to hear me share some examples of when Christianity got science wrong.
Oh.
Yes, we'll see how that goes.
I've got some interesting information that I had never looked into because, like I mentioned, I was probably in the camp of don't care, doesn't matter as much, not really sure what these things mean, so leave it be. But I got some details on fossils and carbon dating,
Ooh, I
which
like
was
that.
new to me, and yeah, kind of cool topics that I hadn't ever really looked at.
I know about carbon dating. I don't think I understand carbon dating. So I am excited to hear
Oh, I
the
don't
next
know if
part
you're
of
going to
this conversation.
understand carbon dating more than after I talk about it, but I did learn some interesting things about how scientists, I guess, and probably geologists specifically use carbon dating and how it might support or contradict a few of these theories.
Well, great. Cool. Well, I hope we catch you next time, members. Thank you for listening. If you are listening to this, please would you leave us a like or a comment or a subscription on whatever platform you're on? We'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and until next time, burn bright.